My mom called me the morning of the hearing to tell me I was making a fool of myself. Not good luck. Not I hope it goes well. She called to tell me that showing up without a lawyer was the most embarrassing thing I had ever done, and that if I lost, I should not expect anyone in the family to feel sorry for me. I held the phone against my ear and watched the condensation slide down the side of my coffee cup. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I told her I would see her in court. She laughed before I could hang up. That laugh stayed with me the entire drive over. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened in that courtroom. I am not telling this story because I need people to feel sorry for me. I am telling it because I spent a long time believing that the way my family saw me was the truth. That the version of me they carried in their heads, the one who was too quiet, too serious, too stubborn, who had made choices they didn't understand, and therefore choices that must have been wrong. I spent years thinking that version was accurate. This story is about the morning I finally stopped believing that. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small city in central Ohio, the second of 3 children, the only daughter. My older brother, Marcus, was the one my parents talked about at dinner. He had gone into finance, married early, bought a house in the same suburb where my parents lived, and showed up to every holiday with a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My younger brother, Danny, was the funny one, the one who could make my father laugh even when my father hadn't laughed in weeks. And then there was me. I was the one who read too much, the one who asked too many questions, the one who, at 16, got into an argument with my mother at the Thanksgiving table about whether the family was actually as close as everyone pretended to be, and was told to go to my room and think about my attitude. I went to my room and read for 3 hours, and did not feel sorry about a single word I had said. I joined the army at 22. Not because I didn't have other options. I had a partial scholarship to a state school, and a vague plan to study something practical, but because something about it felt honest in a way that very little else did at the time. My recruiter was a woman named Sergeant Holloway, who had the kind of face that made you feel she had already heard every excuse in existence and was entirely unimpressed by all of them. She told me the army would be hard, and that hard was not the same as bad. I believed her. I signed the papers 3 weeks later. My mother did not speak to me for 11 days after I told her. When she did speak to me again, it was to inform me that she had told her book club that I was taking a year to figure things out, and that she would appreciate it if I did not contradict that version of events at family gatherings. I told her I understood. I did not tell her that I thought it was one of the saddest things she had ever said to me. My father was quieter about it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table the night before I left for basic training and stirred his coffee for a long time without drinking it. Finally, he said, "You're going to be far away." I said yes. He said, "You could still change your mind." I said I knew that. He said, "Your mother worries." I said I knew that too. He went back to stirring his coffee. We sat there for another 20 minutes, and then I went to bed. And in the morning I got into a car with my 2 bags, and I drove away from that house, and I did not look back until I was already on the highway, and by then, it was just a shape getting smaller. Basic was everything Sergeant Holloway had promised. Hard in ways I had not fully imagined. Clarifying in ways I had not expected. I discovered that I was good at staying calm in situations that made other people loud. I was good at reading a room, at noticing what wasn't being said, at waiting for the right moment instead of pushing before it arrived. My drill sergeant told me after my first month that I had the best poker face he had ever seen on a recruit, and that I should either become an officer or a professional gambler. I told him I was considering law school. He laughed and said those were basically the same thing. I finished my undergraduate degree through the Army's Tuition Assistance Program, studying political science, and then pre-law, and then I sat for the LSAT and scored high enough that I had options. I chose a program that had a strong military law track. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I was commissioned as a Judge Advocate General Officer, a JAG Corps attorney, at 28 years old. I want you to understand what that means, because my family did not understand it, and I think that is important to the story. A JAG officer is a licensed attorney who practices law within the military justice system. We handle courts-martial, legal assistance, administrative law, international law. We are officers and we are lawyers simultaneously. We carry rank and we carry a bar license. When I walked into a military courtroom, I walked in as both. My family knew none of this. Or rather, They knew the words, in the way you know the words to a song in a language you don't speak. They heard she's in the army, something with law, and filed it under a category they had already built for me. The category labeled, Things Claire Does That Don't Quite Make Sense, and they moved on to talking about Marcus's new car. The first few years, I tried. I would come home for Christmas and bring photographs, try to explain what I was working on, describe a case in terms I thought they could follow. My mother would listen with the careful, slightly pained expression she used when she was waiting for me to finish, so she could redirect the conversation towards something that felt more real to her. Marcus would ask if I was making good money in a tone that made clear he already assumed the answer was no. Danny, to his credit, would sometimes ask genuine questions, and those moments were the ones I held on to. But something had calcified in the way they saw me. I had left. I had chosen something they didn't understand. And because they didn't understand it, they had decided, somewhere along the way, that it must not be worth very much. I stopped going home for Christmas after the year Marcus made a comment at the dinner table about how it must be nice to have the government basically paying for everything while the rest of the family had to actually work for a living. I put down my fork. I looked at him across the table. He had gravy on his tie. I thought about the things I had seen and done in the past 6 years, the deployments, the prosecutions, the soldiers I had defended and the ones I had prosecuted, the mornings I had woken up before sunrise to review case files in a room with no heat because the building's furnace was broken, and I thought about all the ways that what I was doing was, in fact, work. Real work. Hard work. The kind of work that asks things from you that you cannot always get back. I didn't say any of that. I picked my fork back up, and I finished my dinner, and I drove home to my apartment that night, and I cried for about 15 minutes, which I consider a reasonable amount of time under the circumstances, and then I washed my face and went to bed. I called my mother the next morning. I told her that I loved her, and that I needed some distance, and that I would reach out when I was ready. She told me I was being dramatic. I told her maybe so. I hung up and blocked the number for 6 months, because I knew myself well enough to know that if she could reach me, I would keep picking up. Those 6 months were some of the clearest of my life. I want to tell you about the week before the hearing, because I think it matters. My father had been diagnosed with a mild heart condition 2 years prior. Nothing immediately dangerous, but the kind of thing that makes a family start asking questions about the future. He had updated his estate documents, his will, his financial power of attorney, all of it, and in doing so, he had made changes that my mother and Marcus had apparently not been expecting. He had designated me as his primary healthcare proxy. Me. Not Marcus, not my mother. He had called me one afternoon and explained his reasoning in his quiet, coffee-stirring way. He said I was the most level-headed person he knew. He said he trusted me to do what he actually wanted, not what was easiest. He said he was sorry it had taken him so long to say that out loud. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we hung up. Marcus was furious. My mother was furious. They hired an attorney, a private practice estate lawyer named Gerald Foss, according to the documents I received, and filed a petition to challenge the designation on the grounds that I was, quote, geographically and emotionally distant from the family unit, and therefore not a suitable proxy. They wanted the designation transferred to Marcus. They did not tell my father they were filing. He found out when I called him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do what you need to do, Claire." He said it like a man who had been tired for a long time and had finally decided to stop pretending otherwise. I told him I would handle it. I did not tell him how. I took leave. I drove to the county courthouse in the city where I had grown up. I filed my response to the petition without hiring outside counsel, because I did not need outside counsel. I was outside counsel. I was, in fact, a licensed attorney with extensive experience in exactly the kind of proceeding they were attempting to initiate, with the additional credential of understanding, from the inside, how courts evaluate capacity, intent, and proxy designation challenges. I did not list my credentials in the filing. I listed my name, my address, and my response to each of their claims. I kept the language clean and precise, the way I had been trained to. And then I drove to my hotel and I ordered room service, and I watched a documentary about ocean geology, and I went to sleep. The morning of the hearing I put on my uniform, not because I was required to. I was on leave. I could have worn anything, but I had thought about it carefully. And I had decided that walking into that courtroom as exactly who I was, not a daughter who had run away and made confusing choices, not the family oddity who showed up at Christmas and made people uncomfortable, but a United States Army officer and licensed attorney felt like the right way to begin. The uniform is not a costume. It's not armor, not in the way people sometimes mean it. It is a record of what you have done and where you have been. Every ribbon, every badge, every piece of it has been earned through something specific. When I put it on, I am not performing. I am simply being accurate. I got to the courthouse 40 minutes early. I sat in my car in the parking lot and I drank the last of my coffee, and I read through my notes one more time. Not because I needed to, but because I find the act of reading through notes before a hearing settling like a brief conversation with yourself before you walk into a room. At 8:45, a silver Mercedes pulled into the lot. Marcus got out first, then my mother. He was in a suit that I recognized as expensive. She was in a blazer and had her hair done, the way she did it for special occasions. Behind them, a man I took to be Gerald Foss, late 50s, briefcase. The slightly harassed expression of an attorney who has been in enough courtrooms to find them unremarkable. Marcus looked around the parking lot with the air of someone expecting something and not finding it. Then he spotted my car. He said something to my mother. She looked over. I watched her register that the car was mine, look at the building, and then look back at the car with an expression I recognized as the early stages of the pity face, the one she used when she was preparing to feel sorry for someone in a way that contained no actual sorrow. I got out of the car. The uniform stopped them. Not dramatically, not the way it would happen in a film. No sharp intake of breath, no obvious double take, but there was a pause brief, maybe 3 seconds where all three of them were processing something they hadn't expected. My mother's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on a version of carefully neutral that I knew from long experience meant she was recalibrating. Marcus recovered first. He walked toward me with his hands in his pockets and that particular smile he used when he wanted to seem confident. He said, "You actually came." I said, "Of course I came." He looked at the uniform the way people sometimes look at something they don't want to acknowledge noticing. He said, "You didn't have to dress up." I said, "I didn't." My mother came up beside him. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, in a low voice that was probably intended to be kind, "Claire, sweetheart, you know you don't have to do this yourself. We could have Gerald add you to the discussions. You don't need to be in there fighting." I said, "I appreciate that." I picked up my briefcase. I said, "I'll see you inside." I walked ahead of them into the building. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I was used to. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the particular quiet of a room waiting for something to happen. A clerk was arranging papers at the front. A bailiff stood near the door. I checked in, confirmed my name, took my seat at the respondent's table. I set my briefcase on the table, and opened it, and organized my materials in the order I would need them. I uncapped my pen and wrote the date in the top right corner of my legal pad. I looked at the front of the room and then I looked at my notes and I thought about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. At the table across from me, Gerald Foss was doing the same thing. He glanced over once, briefly, with the professional appraisal of an attorney checking out opposing counsel, then looked back at his own papers. Then he looked over again, this time a little longer. I kept my eyes on my notes. My mother and Marcus settled into the seats behind the petitioner's table. I heard my mother murmur something. I heard Marcus say something back. I did not catch the words, but I recognized the tone, the low, private amusement of people who are confident about the outcome of something. It was the same tone he had used at the Christmas dinner table, the same tone she had used on the phone that morning. I turned a page on my legal pad. The judge entered. We rose. Her name, according to the court documentation, was the Honorable Sandra Whitmore. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the slightly preoccupied expression of someone who has seen enough courtroom drama to find most of it pedestrian. She settled into her chair, looked at the room, and opened the file in front of her. She looked at the petitioner's table. She said, "Gerald Foss, appearing on behalf of petitioners Margaret and Marcus Ellery." Foss said, "That's correct, Your Honor." She looked at the respondent's table. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "And you are appearing pro se, Ms. Ellery?" I said, "I am, Your Honor," she said. "And you understand what that means?" That you are representing yourself without the assistance of an attorney? I said, I do, Your Honor. She looked at me over her glasses for a moment. Not with skepticism, exactly. More with the particular attention of someone noticing a variable they hadn't accounted for. Then she went back to the file. Foss opened. He was competent, organized, measured, built his argument on the geographic and emotional distance framing methodically. I listened and took notes and let him finish. When he was done, I watched the judge make a note in her margin. She said, Miss Ellery, your response. I stood. I want to tell you exactly what I said, because I had thought about it carefully, and I believe the words matter. I said, Your Honor, the petitioner's argument rests on two claims. The first is that my geographic distance from the family makes me unsuitable to act as my father's healthcare proxy. The second is that my emotional distance creates an additional barrier to effective decision-making in a crisis. I would like to address both. I addressed the first one by presenting the documentation I had prepared, my current duty station, my leave status, my legal standing as a licensed attorney in the state of Ohio, my bar number, and my years of experience practicing in matters that required exactly the kind of measured judgment a healthcare proxy must exercise. I watched Foss stop writing mid-sentence. I continued. I said that geographic presence at holidays is not the same as capacity for clear-headed decision-making in a medical emergency. I said that the petitioner's assertion of emotional closeness would need to be weighed against the documented evidence which I presented that my father had chosen me specifically because he trusted my judgment to reflect his wishes rather than anyone else's preferences. I put a document on the table, the letter my father had written to his estate attorney explaining his reasoning. I had asked him for a copy. He had given it to me without hesitating. I said, My father is not incapacitated. He made this designation while in full possession of his faculties, with the assistance of legal counsel, after careful deliberation. The question before this court is not which family member has been physically present at the most holiday gatherings. The question is, which family member is most likely to honor his stated wishes under pressure? I submit to the court that his documented, considered choice should be given exactly the weight a competent adult's considered choice deserves. I sat down. The room was quiet. Foss was looking at his papers but not reading them. He had the expression of someone rapidly revising their assessment of a situation. The judge was reading the letter. She read it twice. I watched her eyes move through it once, and then return to the top. She turned a page. She read through to the end. She set it down. She took her glasses off and looked at the front of the room in the particular way judges sometimes do when they are thinking without wanting you to see exactly what they are thinking. Then she looked at Foss. She said, Counselor, your clients are petitioning to override a clearly stated and documented choice made by a competent adult. Foss said, Your Honor, our position is that the nature of the relationship between, she said, I have the documentation in front of me. She tapped the letter. This is a detailed, articulate explanation of a considered decision. I also have Ms. Ellery's credentials in front of me, which I have to say I was not expecting when this case came to my docket. She glanced at me over her glasses. Your JAG Corps. I said, Yes, Your Honor. She said, How long? I said, 6 years as a commissioned officer. I've been practicing law for 5. She looked back at Foss. She said, Your clients filed a petition to override the designated proxy of a competent adult on the grounds that she is geographically and emotionally distant, and the proxy is, she paused, and looked at her notes, a licensed attorney with 5 years of JAG Corps experience, who drove to this county voluntarily, represented herself clearly and professionally, and submitted documentation that directly contradicts the factual foundation of your petition. Foss said quietly, Your Honor, if I may, she said. You may, briefly. He spoke for about 2 minutes. He was a competent attorney, and he did what competent attorneys do when the ground shifts. He found the best remaining footing and stood on it. He argued that regardless of credentials, the question of relationship and proximity was one the court should consider. He was not wrong that it was a question. He was simply unable to make a compelling case that the answer favored his clients. When he finished, the judge made several notes. Then she looked at the back of the courtroom where my mother and Marcus were sitting. I had not looked at them during the proceedings. I looked now. My mother's hands were folded in her lap with a tightness that I recognized. Marcus was looking at the table in front of Foss. Neither of them was looking at me. Neither of them was wearing the expression they had worn in the parking lot. The judge spoke directly to them. She said, "I want to be very clear. A competent adult chose his healthcare proxy. He chose her for reasons he has articulated in writing. This court has no basis for overriding that choice, and I want to be certain you understand why. Not because the petitioner's concerns are invalid as a general matter, but because they are not supported by anything in front of me. Distance is not disqualification. The absence of frequent holiday visits is not evidence of incapacity for care." She looked back at her papers. She said, "Petition is denied. The designation stands." She closed the file. She said, "Is there anything else before we adjourn?" There wasn't. I gathered my materials with the same deliberateness I had used when I laid them out. I capped my pen. I closed my briefcase. I stood when the judge stood, and I remained standing until she had left the room. I did not look at Foss as I passed his table. I heard my mother's chair move behind me. I heard Marcus say something, low and sharp, that I could not make out. I pushed through the door into the hallway and kept walking. The hallway had tall windows on one side and pale linoleum floors, and the particular hollow quiet of a public building in the late morning. I walked to the end of it, and then I stood by a window and looked out at the parking lot. I could see my car from there. I could see the silver Mercedes. I stayed there for a few minutes. I was not waiting for anyone. I was just standing there, because sometimes after something is over, you need a moment to let the overness of it settle in. I heard footsteps behind me, my mother's voice. "Claire." I turned around. She was alone. She had left Marcus somewhere with Foss. Maybe. Or he was still in the courtroom. She stood in the middle of the hallway and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, or not in memory. Something that was trying to be several things at once and not quite succeeding at any of them. She said, "I didn't know you were a lawyer." I said, "I know." She said, "You never said." I thought about all the Christmases, all the phone calls, all the moments I had tried to explain what I was doing and watched her face rearrange itself into polite waiting. I said, "I did, actually, more than once." She looked at me. She said, "I suppose I didn't listen." It was not an apology. I want to be careful about that, because I think if I call it an apology, it sounds like a resolution, and I don't think it was quite that. Not yet. It was more like the first correct sentence of a conversation that had a very long way still to go. I said, "No, you didn't." She said, "You were very impressive in there." I said, "Thank you." There was a silence. She looked at her hands and then back at me. She said, "Your father is going to want to know how it went." I said, "I'll call him." She said, "He." She stopped. She started again. "He's proud of you. He doesn't always say it, but he is." I didn't say anything for a moment. There was something in my chest that wanted to respond to that with something large and emotional, and I let it pass, because I had learned over the years that the large emotional responses are usually for later, when you're alone, when you have the space to let them be what they are. In hallways outside courtrooms, I prefer to stay level. I said, "I'm glad." She looked at me for another moment. She said, "I should go find Marcus." I said, "Okay." She started to walk past me, then stopped. She turned back. She said, "Claire." She looked like she was searching for something, the right words, maybe, or the right version of herself to say them with. She said, "I'm sorry. I mean that." I looked at her. My mother, 61 years old, in her good blazer with her hair done for a hearing she had come to expecting to win, standing in a courthouse hallway saying the word "sorry" in a voice that sounded like it had cost her something real. I said, "I know. I meant it. I think I did. Not in the way that means everything is resolved, or that the years of quiet dismissal are erased, or that we go back to being a family that calls each other easily and says what we mean on the first attempt. I meant it in the smaller, more honest way that I believed she was sorry in this moment, and that this moment was something, even if it wasn't everything." She nodded. She walked away down the hall. Her footsteps were quiet on the linoleum. I stood there for another minute. Then I picked up my briefcase, walked out through the front doors of the courthouse, and stood on the steps in the March cold for a moment, just long enough to breathe. I called my father from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's over. Designation stands." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Just that one word. But in the tone I had been hearing from him my entire life, the compressed, understated version of something much larger. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." He said, "Your mother was there?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And?" I thought about the hallway. The word sorry, in a voice that cost something. I said, "She said she was proud of you for choosing me." That was not exactly what she had said, but I thought it was probably true, and I thought he needed to hear it more than he needed precision. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Come for dinner sometime. Just you and me. No occasion." I said, "I'd like that." He said, "Good." I drove back to my hotel and changed out of my uniform and folded it carefully and put it away. I sat on the edge of the bed for a little while. Outside the window, the sky was the particular pale gray of a Midwestern March. Not quite overcast, not quite clear, just honest about the fact that it hadn't decided yet. I thought about the things I believe. I believe that people can change, or at least that they can begin to. I believe that the word sorry, when it comes from a place of actual cost, is worth something even when it doesn't fix everything. I believe that showing up as exactly who you are, not performing, not shrinking, not dressing yourself in what other people are comfortable with, is one of the only forms of honesty that actually reaches people. Sometimes it reaches them too late. Sometimes it reaches them just in time. I think about my father stirring his coffee at that kitchen table the night before I left. I think about all the years between that night and this one. I think about the letter he wrote to his estate attorney, the careful, private words he used to explain why he chose me. And I think about the fact that he had been watching, all along, in that quiet way of his. He had been watching, and he had been keeping count of something that had nothing to do with holidays or phone calls or the appearance of closeness. He had been counting on who I actually was. That is a thing I will carry for a long time. I ordered dinner to the room and watched half of a movie, and fell asleep before the ending. In the morning I drove home in the early light, with the windows down a little, even though it was cold, and the road was mostly empty, and I had the particular feeling I get sometimes after something hard is over, not triumph. Exactly. And not relief. Exactly, but something quieter and more durable than either one. The feeling that you handled something the way you meant to, that you walked into the room as yourself, and you walked out the same way. I think that is all any of us can really ask for. If there is someone in your life who has not looked closely enough to see what you have built, who has kept their old version of you because it is easier than updating, because the new version asks something of them, a kind of acknowledgement they are not ready to give, I want to say this to you directly. Their version is not the true one. You do not need their courtroom to recognize you. You only need to recognize yourself clearly enough to walk in and sit down and do what you came to do. The recognition tends to follow. Not always. Not from everyone. But it follows. And on the days it doesn't, you still drove home with the windows down. You still had the feeling. You still walked out the same person who walked in. That is not nothing. That, in fact, is almost everything.